reaction to my big opinion monologue. I'm calling it a bold budget. Yes, it's a gamble, but it's a budget that believes in Britain, believes in Britain's businesses and the hard-working people that go out to work every day and put in a shift. But what do you think, Mark at gbnews.uk? Opinion divided, let me tell you. First of all, we've got this from Rick. Mark, fantastic budget. Radical change was massively overdue. Well done, Liz. However, Chris says Truss is a wannabe Thatcher. She's a very dangerous and deceitful woman. Thinks she has to be harder than a man to prove she can do the job rather than just doing the job. Fair chance that her rhetoric will cause the end of the world as we know it. Very pessimistic view from Chris there. If the world does end, you'll get live coverage here on GB News. I'll stay on air, obviously. How about this from Andy? Liz Truss hasn't delivered everything she promised. She promised to cut fuel duty, and she has not. And strong words now from Julie. Hi, Julie. Thanks for your email. No one gets censored on my show. Julie says, today's shit budget. How stupid are you townies? There is more people living in the country, not just bloody London. I'm on a widow's pension of £9,000 a year. I don't pay tax or national insurance because I do not earn enough. I'm also disabled. I get an extra £122 a week. When will you rich so-and-sos work it out? We are poor and struggling. Look, there you go. That is a very, very strong view from Julie, who feels that this budget has let her down. And looking at the figures that she's quoted, hard to disagree. But the question is, will the idea of boosting economic growth help everyone? Does it help Julie as well as the rich or not? Keep those opinions coming. Mark at gbnews.uk. Time now for this. Yes, it's time for the big question in which we tackle a major news story of the day. Tonight, following the mini-budget in which Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng unveiled a package of tax cuts worth £45 billion. Is the budget reckless? Could it cause a crash in the value of the pound? I mean, it's not looking great at the moment, is it? And could it finish off an economy still recovering from the pandemic? And is it fair to saddle future generations with yet more borrowing? First, though, let's have a listen to the man himself. Summing up his budget, here's Kwasi Kwarteng.
Plan, Mr. Speaker, is to expand the supply side of the economy through tax incentives and reform. That is how we will deliver higher wages, greater opportunities, and crucially, Mr. Speaker, fund public services now and into the future. That is how we will compete successfully with dynamic economies around the world. And that is how, Mr. Speaker, we will turn this vicious cycle of stagnation into a virtuous cycle of growth.
Well, is this the right approach to the future of our economy? To debate this, I'm delighted to welcome economic heavyweight Christopher Snowdon from the IEA and financial wizard Jonathan Davis, who is the star of the Booms and Bust podcast. Look, I'm going to have a word with Christopher in a moment, but let me go straight to you first, Jonathan, if I can, because you were on my radio show 2 years ago at the in the kind of, I suppose, the early stages of the pandemic. And you told me on that show, it was a very doom-laden conversation, and you said inflation is coming. You're the only economist I spoke to over the period of those few months that mentioned inflation. You've been proved right.
In November of 2020, right at the end of that year, inflation was still under 1%. It's now 11%. And it's not because...
Is that the official figure, by the way?
RPI, 11% RPI.
Fine.
And it's not because of the nonsense, but the war 2,000 miles to the east. It's because of what all the politicians have done for the last 25 years. They have destroyed the pound. They have gone for the green nonsense. So oil and gas companies have not been able to find and produce oil and gas. Expensive renewables, inefficient. So when we came out of the lockup, I don't call it lockdown, it was imprisonment. When we came out of lockup and demand soared and there wasn't the energy to go around, that's the reason why prices for energy have soared. Yeah. And hence, in a year and a half, 2 years, inflation has gone through the roof. Now,
do you think, briefly, in the absence of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, do you think inflation would still be very high?
Of course it would be. The price of oil was $20 a barrel on the world stage in April, May of 2020. Before the Ukraine thing, it had already topped $100 in less than 2 years. So, that was just the icing on the cake. It had already been soaring. And as I say, it's 25 years of mismanagement, of maladministration by all the politicians, not this side or that side. And basically, I've been saying for years that eventually the chickens would come home to roost. The chickens are now clocking. Why? Because, for example, we've still got over $2,000 billion of debt, pounds of debt. That's the government alone, never mind household and corporate. But a year and a half ago, the interest rate on that was less than 1%. Now it's 3.5%. That's an enormous increase that taxpayers today and in the future are going to have to stump up. And unfortunately, this so-called mini-budget is red herring as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't even remotely get to the fundamental problems in our economy. All it does is focus on the general election, which, funnily enough, is what every politician does, every government does 2 years before a general election.
So what would you say? Energy independence and stop printing money. Would that be a place to start?
We could easily have had energy independence. I know that she's talking about fracking and getting the gas out the ground, which we desperately need to do. I know they're talking about licences in the North Sea. I know they're talking about new nuclear plants. None of it's going to be there for at least 2030. So it's not going to help the cost of energy for many, many years. And printing money, there's an idea, there's a myth that the Bank of England, that the central bank or the Federal Reserve in the US or the European Central Bank and Uncle Tom Cobley, they can control inflation by raising interest rates, for example. Well, let me give you an example. Argentina has got 70% interest rates and 70% inflation. No, it's not about central banks, it's about politicians and governments. They are massively overspending. The fiscal stimulus in 2020 and 21, literally handing money in businesses to do nothing. Well, of course, that's what creates huge inflation. And that's where we are. There needs to be a slashing of government spending, not austerity, which George Osborne didn't actually do, by the way, although he talked about it every day that he was Chancellor.
Bottled a lot of it, didn't he?
Bottled. He was never going to do it in the first place. We need a slashing of government spending. We need a slashing of regulations and of quangos. There's far too much public sector civil servant nonsense in the UK.
Let's speak to another good friend of the show. Do stay with us, Jonathan, because I'm delighted to welcome Christopher Snowdon from the IEA. And Christopher, your organisation, a highly respected economic think tank, has given this budget the thumbs up.
Well, broadly speaking, and we all have different views, I'm basically in favour of it. What I've just heard from Jonathan actually is music to my ears. The IEA were warning inflation in June 2020, precisely because of the amount of money printing. And there's been a lot of stupid objections to the budget I've heard today, but one of the legitimate ones is that it may further fuel inflation. And one of the most important things right now is to get inflation down. Well, probably the second most important thing is to get the deficit down. But looking in the bigger picture is we've been in a slump for a very, very long time. And I mean, Hillary, who had on before, kind of epitomized the problem, which is that she looks at the budget and says, well, what's this going to do for people in the bottom quintile and so on? Budgets aren't there for that. Not every policy is about making sure that you're handing out money to people in various different parts of the income distribution. We have a welfare state for that. The energy price cap is massively redistributing money. Some policy should be based around generating economic growth. Not everything in this budget, I think, will do that. And in fact, everything in this budget taken together will not really be enough necessarily even to avoid inflation, let alone economic growth, but there is some good stuff in there. You know, there was the idea we should be raising corporation tax was ridiculous. Stamp duty needs cutting. It really hinders growth apart from anything else because people can't move. It reduces the number of household purchases. You'll probably get more revenue actually if you do cut it. The national insurance rise probably shouldn't have happened. It's not a good idea to be taking money out of people's pockets. On the other hand, I think the 45p income tax cut could have probably waited for another day. That's taken all the headlines. I think it's really bad politics to be announcing that. It's only £2 billion. It's not going to make much difference either way. It's possible we might get people pouring over the Scottish border to take advantage of that rate, which would be quite funny. But the optics obviously are not great on that. The 1p off, most people's income tax, kind of a good thing here or there, but don't forget, people's energy bills are at least doubling this winter, even with the price cap. So taking a penny off income tax is not going to necessarily forestall a recession. So I am in favor. The principle behind it is great. It's great that we're having a change in direction. The old way of doing things was not working, and the dash for growth is the only thing that can save us. It's our only way out of the woods is economic growth, but it's going to require a lot more than a penny off income tax. We need to see now a lot of deregulation and dealing with the fundamental problems rather than accepting that we have problems like a housing crisis, like very expensive childcare, and this borrowing money and giving it to people so they can afford these inflated prices. That's been the problem for a very long time.
Christopher, the support for people's energy bills and businesses is expected to cut inflation in half to about 5%. And then it's been speculated, and it's certainly my view, that we will have a shallower and shorter recession thanks to these tax cuts. But what about the currency traders, the international bond markets? What about Britain's credibility? Are we playing with fire with this level of borrowing?
I think the markets will come round. I mean, people have been talking about it being a 45 billion tax cut. It's not. 19 billion of that is not raising corporation tax. It's not a cut if you haven't raised it to begin with. So we're still looking at significant amounts of money, 20 billion this year, 25 billion probably next year. If you assume there are no dynamic effects, if you assume that these things don't actually work, they don't do what they're supposed to do, they don't generate growth, which they will. It's a significant sum of money. But if you look over the course of the last 14 years, what we've been borrowing every year, it's not actually that much. And I'm a fiscal conservative. I'm very keen on getting the deficit down. But I do take the argument. I understand, I think, where Liz Truss and Kwasi are coming from on this, which is, we all want to balance the books. But we took a big wrong turn a long time ago with the British economy. We became addicted to low interest rates and money printing and borrowing. And ironically, we might need to do a bit of borrowing for a couple of years while we turn this tanker around.
Okay, so
because
look,
people won't accept public spending cuts. That's the politics.
Yeah.
People won't accept austerity. So what can you do? The only thing you can do if you want to bring down taxes, which you need to if you're going to turn the economy around, is borrow to make up for that in the short term.
So, Jonathan, look, it's always very informative when we have you on the show. In fact, I've had a flood of emails. They're loving Christopher, but some of them are loving you as well. Jackie says, "Hi, Mark, where did you get this amazing guy, Jonathan, from? Finally, someone talking sense and telling it like it is." However, your message is not a positive one, is it, Jonathan? I mean, I think your overview is that we are moving deck chairs around the Titanic. What is the outlook for the British economy in the medium term?
First of all, it's a global thing that we're in recession. It's going to be huge. I think it's going to be as big as the 2000 to 2003 recession and stock market collapse. In the medium to long term, in fact, well, what we've had for decades is several years of upswing, then 1 or 2 years of recession, and that's repeated for the last 40 odd years.
And anemic growth.
Well, in the long term, which has been helped, in a sense, the other way, because of people borrowing more. So they had more cash to buy stuff. I think that the cycle of boom and bust is going to be much reduced from now on. We've just had 2 years of boom. I think we're now going to have 1 or 2 years of bust. Then we'll have, because they'll stimulate again, they'll fiscally stimulate, they'll hand money left, right and centre to people, to businesses, basically to do nothing. They'll bail everyone out again, and we'll get another couple of years of growth, or 3 years. and then there'll be another bust. So the cycles over the next 10 to 20 years, I'm forecasting, will be much shorter. Boom, bust, ultimately no net growth into the 2030s.
And this would be the UK and Western Europe, I would have thought.
Indeed.
USA?
Probably the US, because they're basically doing the same as we are. They're stimulating like crazy, and of course, cost of borrowing is raising there as well.
Christopher, a gloomy outlook. Are you as pessimistic?
No, it's unusual for me not to be the most pessimistic on a show like this. No, I mean, I'm assuming here that Truss and Kwasi will follow through with the rest of their program. This is only the first chapter of their growth program, because as I say, this stuff today alone will not be sufficient. There needs to be serious reform of various forms of regulation. We need to be following through on getting more energy, fracking, all the rest of these things to get the economy going, and making this a place where people want to set up a business, where they want to expand the business, and where businesses from abroad want to move here. And I think they've made a pretty good start to that today. Assuming they do that, I agree with Jonathan. If we didn't do any of this, he's basically right. We would just carry on in this slump indefinitely. So would USA, so would Europe. But I think the most optimistic possibility, which I do think is perfectly plausible, is that this time next year, inflation is down to 3, 4, 5%. Interest rates around about 3 or 4%. We've just about avoided a recession because of the energy price cap. We may even have growth of probably not 2.5%, but possibly 1.5%, and it's onwards and upwards from there. I'm not saying that's definitely going to happen. It's probably the best case scenario, but if that is a position in a year's time, I think we should all be very happy with that.
A few seconds. Last word to you, Jonathan Davies.
Inflation is coming down because we're entering recession. It's nothing to do with what the Bank of England is doing. And funnily enough, I walked past the governor of the Bank of England in Threadneedle Street today, coincidentally.
Did you? Did you give him a dirty look? Did you throw him some daggers?
Best not go there. This is the family show. So inflation's coming down. You're quite right. But unemployment's going to rise, house prices are going to fall. These clearly are negatives for the economy. And as I say, it's not a lot to do with what little UK government or Bank of England does. It's the global economy.
Well, look, Jonathan Davies is a top financial planner and advisor. He's the star and creator of the Booms and Bust podcast. Check him out online, Jonathan Davies, Davis, and another good friend of mine, economic heavyweight, it says on the script by Tom. He's absolutely right. From the Institute of Economic Affairs, from the luxury of his well-appointed home and that rather posh armchair of his, Christopher Snowdon. Chris, thanks so much for joining us as well. Lots of emails coming in, but what do you think? GB Views? No, let's go for Mark. Mark at gbnews.uk. It's my show tonight, isn't it? Mark at gbnews.uk. Let me know your thoughts. Is this particular budget reckless? OK, we'll look